Okay, all right. So we will get started. Thanks again so much for coming to the CBFE orientation today. So before we dive into the CBFE, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the MOT curriculum, just to help provide some context for where your students are at when they're coming to see you this summer. So for many of you, this will be a review, and for some of you, it will feel like new information. So on the slide here, we have an overview of our typical MOT curriculum program. And lately, nothing seems typical. But typically, we do have a 4-week basic fieldwork placement for our students in first year in November, December. And then at the end of the academic year, typically our students have an 8-week intermediate 1 fieldwork placement. In second year, they have their 3rd fieldwork placement in January, February. That's their intermediate 2 fieldwork placement. And that's followed at the very end of academics by their advanced fieldwork transition to practice placement, which is typically 6 weeks. So, however, in the fall of 2021, with the strike that was taking place at the University of Manitoba, we were not able to do basic fieldwork in the fall. So instead, students completed all of their academics, and then they did a 3-week basic fieldwork placement and a shortened 5-week intermediate 1 fieldwork placement in May, June of last year. And then this class in second year came back and they did a 9-week intermediate 2 placement in January and February, which would typically be 8 weeks, but we extended it to 9 to make up the time. And now they're coming to see you for advanced fieldwork for 8 weeks. Typically, it would be 6 weeks coming into advanced, but it is 8 weeks, again, to help make up for some of that time that we lost during the strike. So these are the students that are coming to see you this summer, just to provide you with that context. Hopefully next year we'll be back on track to a more regular schedule. So what I'd like you to see from this particular slide is an understanding of how our students are developing across these 4 placements. Again, for many of you, this will be familiar, but just to review, our basic placement is our level 1 exposure placement. We call it exposure, but really we're hoping that students become actively involved and working with you with your caseload. Then we have in the middle here the acquisition phase, and this is they tend to be longer placements. This encompasses our intermediate 1 and intermediate 2 fieldwork placements. And these are the placements where students are really, it's really geared toward providing students with opportunities for lots of practice and experience with assessment and treatment and sort of being involved in client care and really developing their abilities and their reasoning so that they will eventually be ready to move to this integration phase. And this last integration phase is what we refer to as our advanced fieldwork placement. So these are the students that are coming to you this summer for their advanced transition to practice placement. So this table provides another way that we can look at these stages. Again, many of you have seen this table. What I really want to draw your attention to is the levels of fieldwork. Level 1 is what we refer to as basic fieldwork. Level 2 encompasses our intermediate 1 and intermediate 2 fieldwork. And level 3 encompasses our advanced fieldwork. The reason I'm drawing your attention to these levels is because these levels really coincide with the CBFE, the competency-based fieldwork evaluation. Level 1 being basic, level 2, intermediate 1 and 2, and level 3 are your advanced level students that are coming to see you this summer. We know that way back in basic, your role as an educator was very direct and active with your student. You were functioning much more as a hands-on educator. Whereas in intermediate 1 and 2, your role was much more of a coach and you were working more collaboratively with your student. Now, when your students are coming to you in advanced fieldwork, once they're orientated and they've had an opportunity to get their feet wet and get familiar with the setting, they're really working towards being able to have that relationship with you where ultimately you'll become more of their mentor and you'll be functioning in more of a consultative way with them towards the end of the placement. So that's a key feature of advanced fieldwork. Granted, it's not all completely linear. Educators will certainly go back to that coaching role, maybe even the educator role for certain pieces of the placement, but just to know that at this level 3, you're really working towards functioning much more as a mentor with the student, with your student. Any questions about those levels? Okay. So that's a quick review of our program and how it's structured. Now, what about the CBFE? So the CBFE was developed a number of years ago out of Western University in collaboration with their OT community. It's now used in all but one of the English-speaking OT programs in Canada. It's also used internationally. For example, it's being used in Limerick in Ireland. It has been mapped successfully to the profile of practice and to the essential competencies, but as you might expect, it has not yet been mapped to the Canadian occupational therapy competencies that were just released. And I'll speak a bit more to that later. It also is a copyrighted evaluation, which means that we do have to follow specific guidelines for how we share it with you and how we share it with our students. So what about the new competencies for OTs in Canada? Just for you to know, nationally, we are in the process of reviewing the CBFE, and we'll be looking at the utility of it in future plans and specifically how it's aligning with the new competencies. I think in particular, there's some important work to be done in looking at how it aligns with the new competency domain for culture, equity, and justice. So I just want you to be aware of that there is a national committee that's really looking closely at redeveloping the CBFE, and there'll be more to come on that. So stay tuned. Just as you become familiar with it, we will eventually be redeveloping it. In terms of the evidence, when the CBFE was developed, it was both field and pilot tested and was really shown to have good face validity and seen to accurately reflect student development. Following the rollout of the CBFE, there was a study presented at COT and it really showed that the CBFE really did typically measure students being ready to transition to practice at the end of their final placement. It also showed us that the current requirement of a minimum of 1,000 hours of field work really related well to students being able to transition to practice. On this slide, you'll see there's a couple of extra resources if you are interested. These were created by Western University. They look at the creation of the CBFE and the implementation of the CBFE. Just a word of caution, because each program applies the CBFE a little bit differently. If you do look at external resources, it's really important to know that there are some sort of smaller differences in terms of how each program implements the CBFE. Just a few notes about accessing the evaluation and expectations. I just want to highlight again that it is a copyright form. We've worked with the publisher to make some changes, but there are some tick boxes that exist that we don't necessarily feel apply to you or to the students. We have purchased copies of the CBFE manuals, and our goal is that every site can have a paper copy if they wish. And so if you don't have a copy, let us know and we will send one out to your site so you've got one on hand. What happens is that each student purchases one of these books, and that allows us to then provide you with an electronic copy, which you should have already received. One thing is about this evaluation is similar to all of our other evaluations, is that you are expected to complete it at midterm and at final. Your student also has the same copy of the evaluation. We call it the student version. The only difference is that at the end of their evaluation, they have a learning log appended to it, which really allows them to track their learning throughout the placement. So both you and your student will be completing this at midterm and final. You're evaluating the student's performance, and the student's doing a self-evaluation of their own performance. One thing to highlight is that as an educator, you're not expected to indicate if the placement is a pass or fail. There is a tick box at the end that asks you to do this. And again, that's part of the form that we have not been able to remove. You're welcome to tick that box off, but it's not an expectation. So moving on to the CBFE manual, I'm going to talk very briefly about the manual, and then we'll look at the evaluation in more detail. So the actual CBFE is not that big in terms of the manual itself. The first section speaks to the development, the history, and some of the evidence, as well as the scoring. And then there are 2 paper copies of the evaluation. The evaluation itself is comprised of 7 competencies. And for each competency, there is a learning objective page in which the student develops a minimum of 1 learning objective for that competency. And then there's also a final overall score at the end, which is really meant to be your synthesis or impression of where the student's at in their development. And we'll look at that a bit later when we look at the form. So to review, there are these 7 competencies that are evaluated at midterm and final using a rating scale and providing comments. Then for each of these competencies, students also have an opportunity to develop their own personal learning objectives and learning plan. And that also gets rated at midterm and final. And then the form also has some demographic information that's similar to the old evaluation. So what are these competencies? Well, again, there's these 7 competencies that the evaluation focuses on. I've listed them here on the slide. Each of these competencies has what we call a competency descriptor, which gives you some insight into what the competency entails. And you'll see that when we look at the form a bit later. So the first one, practice knowledge, really relates to our discipline-specific theory and knowledge. Clinical reasoning encompasses all of the analytical and conceptual thinking, your students' development of their judgment, decision-making, and problem-solving. Competency number 3, facilitating change within a practice process, as you can imagine, really speaks to all of those elements in terms of your students' ability to develop a therapeutic relationship, to perform and carry out assessments and intervention, discharge planning and follow-up, all those key elements of the OT process. Competency number 4, professional interactions and responsibilities, really gets at the relationships that your students developing with their clients, with their colleagues, and also really looking at upholding key ethical and legal standards. Then we have competency number 5, communication, which speaks to all of your students' work towards developing effective, both verbal and nonverbal and written communication. Number 6 speaks to professional development. So looking at your students' self-directed learning and their accountability for their development. And then finally, competency number 7 is about performance management. And this really captures your students' ability with respect to time and resource management, and also their development of their leadership along the way. So having looked at all these competencies, we do recognize that there's some overlap between them. That's just how we understand some evaluations to be. And so as you're working through it, if you have some questions about that, we can certainly discuss that with you. In terms of the structure, again, for each competency, there's 2 parts. There's the competency rating scale, and there's the student learning objective rating scale. So I think what I'd like to do now is give you a tour of the CBFE form. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. I'm going to walk you through the form so that you can look at the evaluation, and it'll just give you a bit of a framework to understand these different pieces as we talk about it. So I'm going to bring up the form. Can someone let me know if they see the form on the slide on the screen now?
Yeah, we can see it. I just have a question.
I see you have a question. Yeah, thanks, Maya.
That's okay. I always found as a student too, I was really confused between number 1 and number 3, like the practice knowledge 1, and then the second half of number 3, which is like basically putting the knowledge into practice, doing intervention, planning, and execution. Is that how we should think of it? As like category 1 is more so having the knowledge, and category 3 is like implementing the knowledge?
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate that question because it's something we've looked at ourselves. And I think the way you describe it makes sense. So, and again, that's where the overlap is. If you can almost think of that practice knowledge in terms of the student's ability or your student's ability to articulate the relevant theories, to speak to them, to sort of discuss or plan with you how they might go about doing something, whereas number 3 really gets at the doing.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? I'll pause and take a look at the screen here. Sorry, I didn't see your hand up earlier, Maya. Okay, if there's no more questions, we'll have a quick peek at the form. So the first couple of pages are very descriptive, just looking at the demographics and a bit of the placement history. There is a spot here you'll see on page 2, or just before page 2, there's a tick box for the student to accept evaluation or to not accept it. Again, we don't expect the students to tick this off, but it is something that remains on the form and we weren't necessarily able to remove it. And then after all of this descriptive information, we get into the real substance of the evaluation. So this is where the competencies start. And so what you'll see on the evaluation is that there's a page that speaks to each competency. So here we have on this page, the first competency, number 1, practice knowledge. And on this page, you'll see right underneath practice knowledge, some bullet points that kind of gives you some insight into the competency. So this is what we refer to as the competency descriptor. The descriptors that provide you with some insight into what the competency is about. Then over to the right, you'll see the stages and the scoring. Now, typically, stage 1 or level 1 is what we refer to as our basic fieldwork placement, with 3 being the maximum. Level 2 is what encompasses typically our intermediate 1 and intermediate 2 fieldwork, with 5 being the maximum for intermediate 1 and 6 being the maximum for intermediate 2. And then we have level 3, which is where we would typically expect our advanced level students to be sitting at this level 3 stage. So that's the stages and the scoring. And then right underneath, you'll see the competency rating scale. And this really reflects a scale that shows your students' development from entry-level students, so all the way from a 1, leading up all the way to entry-level clinician at the rating of an 8. So at midterm and final, you'll have an opportunity to rate your student in terms of where they're at, how on track they are in terms of meeting your expectations by final. So you'll provide a rating at midterm and at final. And then you'll also have an opportunity to provide comments. And this is where you're providing some examples of what your students doing well, some of the key strengths, as well as some of their opportunities for growth and some things that you'd like to see them work on and continue to develop. So that's the competency rating page for practice knowledge. So for each competency, there's also then the learning objective page. So here we have the learning objective page for practice knowledge. And this is where your student is going to develop a minimum of 1 personal learning objective for each competency. So here's the information that they would be recording for practice knowledge. And we'll speak more to the learning objectives later, just giving you a sense of the form right now. At the bottom of the learning objective page is the learning objective rating scale. This is where, as an educator, you will come at midterm and final and make mark a rating as to where you see the student being at, your student being at, in terms of meeting their personal learning objective for that competency. So just to review again, we've got the competency number 1, practice knowledge. We have 1 page for the competency rating scale and 1 page for the learning objective for that competency. And so that pattern just repeats itself all throughout the evaluation. So we get to competency number 2, clinical reasoning, We have the rating scale, the comments, and the learning objective page for the student to complete. And that pattern will repeat itself all the way until we get to the end of the form. So I'm going to scroll a bit quicker here. And that will bring us all the way. So we've gone through the 7 competencies, a page for the competency rating scale, a page for the learning objectives. And then we get to the final item, which is item number 8, which is the overall rating of your students' performance. And again, this here is meant to be more, not so much an average, but your overall synthesis of where you feel they're at in terms of their development. Sorry, I scrolled a little too fast there. Then there's also the opportunity to provide comments at midterm and final, and the directions for future learning. And as you'll likely remember as a student, students love feedback, they love comments. They don't have to be long, but short bullet points and sentences that really capture where you think they're doing well and what some of their strengths are and where you think the opportunities are really, really appreciated. You'll see there's also the opportunity to recommend whether you feel your student should pass the placement or not. Again, this is not something we expect you to do, but you're welcome to. The other piece I just want to mention while we have it here is that the form can be a bit fickle. So we recommend that you do not sign anything until the very final stage of the placement. You want it to be the last thing you do, because often what we find is that the form will lock once you sign it, and then you're no longer able to go back in and edit it. So please just hold off on your signature until make it the last thing you do as you're wrapping up the placement and sending off the form. So that's a quick tour of the form. Are there any questions about the form? We're okay. All right. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint here. Can you see my slide again? The full slide?
Yes.
Thanks, Maya. Okay. So that's a quick tour of the form. So now that we have some sense of the history and the structure of the form and the CBFE, I want to spend some time talking about expectations. So expectations that you would have as an educator in relation to the competencies when it comes time to do the evaluation with your student. So how do you set your placement expectations? What are you measuring against? We're going to talk a little bit more about that. So when you think about the CBFE, the evaluation is really based on the placement expectations that you're setting as an educator. And there's a number of things that you're going to pull together to allow you to set your placement expectations and then to evaluate your student. So the first being the competency descriptors, which you'll find on that competency page. Under each competency, those bullet points will give you some insight into that competency. And the second key thing that's going to help you develop your expectations is the learning outcomes for the particular level of placement. So what those course learning outcomes are for advanced fieldwork. And all of you should have had a copy of that information that we sent you. Now what we've done is we've taken it a step further and we've developed a worksheet or a table, if you will, that outlines the competency as well as the related learning outcome for the course. And then we've provided some sample expectations for what might be a reasonable expectation at the advanced fieldwork level. And then in the final column of this form is we've left it blank and we've left it for you to then think about the placement and think about your environment and your practice setting and begin to write out some expectations of what you would expect for your student to be able to do related to each competency. So this worksheet is something that we fondly refer to as our mapping worksheet. Hopefully each of you have it at your fingertips. We've received feedback that it has been a useful tool. Really, it's designed to help you link your placement expectations to the CBFE. And it gives you a roadmap as well as it gives your student a roadmap for where they're going. One thing I should share is that that mapping worksheet is also shared with students, so they know that educators receive it and they're using this to work on and help them develop your expectations for the student's placement. So further to thinking about your expectations, it's really important to keep in mind that we really see you as the expert. So you're the one that has the knowledge of your placement and the OT role. You really want to think about those opportunities and what your students really going to have the opportunity to develop. You want to think about those learning outcomes that we've outlined for the course, and also think about those competency descriptors for each competency. So you'll have some information at your fingertips as you're thinking about what are those learning opportunities in your environment that your student's going to have the opportunity to participate in. You might want to refer to your fieldwork site profile. You'll again refer to those learning outcomes for the placement, and refer to that mapping worksheet that we provided you with some sample expectations, just to give you an idea of what might be reasonable. Most importantly, I think what I would really want to reinforce is to remind you that you're setting minimum expectations. So really thinking about where do you minimally expect your student to be at by the end of advanced fieldwork? What do you minimally expect your student to do, to be able to do, to show, in order to be rated at an 8 by the end of the placement? What do you want them to be able to do on a regular basis? So having those expectations will really be so helpful to you as you go about completing the evaluation, and also for your student to be able to self-evaluate in terms of where they're at in the placement and how they're coming along in terms of meeting those expectations. Any questions about that? No. So as a review, when it comes time for the midterm evaluation, you're going to rate your student based on your placement expectations and place that rating on the competency rating scale. Your student at the same time is also going to do their own self-evaluation and provide a rating as well as their own comments for how they feel they're doing. This is a paper copy of an example. It relates to basic fieldwork. So here you can see for level 1 basic, 3 would be the maximum. So this is an example of a therapist evaluation where at midterm they provided a rating of a 2, and at final a rating of a 3, both of those indicating that the student was on track for meeting expectations, and then filled in some comments that helped sort of explain and support the rating, all going back to communication. So for your thinking about your advanced students coming to you this summer, if you were coming to complete the evaluation at midterm, a rating higher along the scale, around a 6, possibly even a 7 at midterm, would indicate that your student's on track at midterm. A rating of an 8 at final would clearly indicate that your student's on track for meeting placement expectations at final. I'll talk a bit more about grading in a little bit too. So what do we expect on this rating scale? I'll speak a bit more to our levels of expectations at each level. So for level 1 basic, typically 3 is a mastery of that level. And it means a rating of a 3 means that your student's ready to transition to level 2, right? Intermediate 1 fieldwork. For our level 2 placements, a maximum of 6 really shows or reflects that your student's ready to transition to level 3. So now focusing on level 3, which is where your advanced students are, typically a rating of an 8 by the end of fieldwork shows that reflects that your student is clearly ready to transition to practice, that they're clearly meeting your expectations for that competency. One thing we do realize is that not all students are going to reach an 8 for all competencies, and that's okay. And that'll become more clear as we look at the grading in a little bit. One thing about the final evaluation is we know that as an educator, you're rating the competencies at midterm and final. When it comes to the determination of pass or fail, that's really based on the final marks for each of the 7 competencies. It doesn't include the midterm marks. And ultimately, it's the university program that will determine the pass or fail. So as an educator, your ratings and your comments provide all the information we need to be able to assign a pass or a fail at the end. Whenever there's some concern, especially when there's areas of concern, that's when we'll be in touch with the student and be in touch with you to really look at what's happening. This slide here provides an overall summary of the grading, but I'd like to take maybe a closer look at advanced. So if we think about advanced, this slide here reflects a description of the competency ratings at final. So if you were to rate your student at a 6 at final, that would reflect that they're experiencing some difficulty meeting advanced expectations. If you were to rate your student at a 7, that would indicate for that particular competency that they're nearly meeting advanced level 3 expectations. Whereas if you were to rate them at an 8, that would indicate that their performance clearly meets your expectations for that competency. An 8 would be the maximum that you would give them for advanced. So then when we look at those final overall scores, a 7 or above would mean that the student would probably pass. If the score fell between 6.6 and 6.99, that means that your student would be flagged for review. And if their range average between those 7 competencies was 6.59 or lower, that would mean that your student would probably fail. So something that's important here is I'm sharing this with you so you have a general sense. We don't expect you to provide ratings that might indicate a pass or might indicate a fail. It's so that you have a sense of what these ratings all mean. If there was, when there's a concern at all about the average falling below a 7, or maybe there's some comments that are concerning, and when we flag a student for review, I would always be in touch with you. I'd also be in touch with the student. What happens at that point, if something falls below a 7, is that it's no longer, a pass is no longer assigned by me. I then take all the information through discussion with you and discussion with the student, and then bring that to the progress committee, and the decision for a pass or fail is deferred to the OT progress committee. One thing I would say is that it's clearly the competency ratings at final that determine the overall pass or fail. The midterm marks are not included in that determination, but the midterm marks are still really important. So they really help send a message and provide that sort of guidance to your student about where they're at. If, for example, your student was to be rated at the score of a 5 at midterm, that would indicate that you had some concern that they weren't quite on track for meeting your expectations. And that's when I would want you to reach out to me and have some discussion about where they're at and maybe what we needed to help support and put in place to help the student be as successful as possible, and to also support you as the educator. So if you do have any concerns about the grading at midterm or at final, we are literally just a phone call away, so please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to discuss at any point in time. Questions about grading before we move on? This here provides a review of the intermediate 2 grading, and I see we don't have anyone with an intermediate 2 student today, so I'm not going to review this, except just to highlight that typically we see students at the end of intermediate 2, if they're clearly meeting expectations, that they would receive a rating of a 6, which is essentially the maximum grade for intermediate 2. And we know that just like in our work life, that anytime we go into a different setting or a different role, that sometimes we take a bit of a step forward before we go back. So we do expect that our students coming into advanced fieldwork, that they still may take a little bit of a step backward before they go forward. We don't expect them to be able to always just pick up where they left off, because we know it's a new environment and there's a new set of expectations and people involved. and all of those things. So now that we reviewed the competencies and the expectations, I'm going to move on to the student learning objectives. Sometimes this is referred to as the learning contract or the learning plan or your students' personal learning objectives. What's really key here is to know that these learning objectives are all more within your student's control. They're more under the control of your student. Another really key piece about the learning objectives is that they do not determine pass or fail. Students might, and they do sometimes, carry their learning objectives between placements, and at advanced, they might actually carry one of their learning objectives into practice. So that's really important to know. What happens is that in the very first week, by the end of week 1, students are required to develop a minimum of one personal learning objective for each competency. They're identified by the student as an area they want to focus on. They're really meant to be ideally additional or augmentative learning to the placement expectations that you set as an educator. Your role as the educator is really to ensure that these learning objectives that your students creating are realistic and doable in your setting. So by the end of the first week, we want your student to share their learning objectives with you. Your job is really maybe to help tweak them, provide a bit of advice, but very much it's in the realm of the student's responsibility. If it doesn't seem realistic or it doesn't seem doable, we definitely want you to let your student know that. One thing that's really also important with the learning objectives is that the student will have information all inputted on their learning objective page. And what we need to make sure is that all of that information gets input into your version of the evaluation, so that when it comes time to rating their learning objectives at midterm and final, you have that context of what that actual objective is. So you can simply ask your student to input their learning objective information into your version of the evaluation, or you could copy and paste it in yourself, whatever works for you. To know that, again, at advanced, they'll be developing a minimum of one for each competency. It'll be rated by you as well as your student at midterm and final. And the rating is done using the learning objective rating scale. The learning objectives do not, they're not counted in the determination of pass or fail. They're not numerical. They're very much a visual analog scale. What the students really have to think about, and the learning objective page really dictates this. They have to think about their goal. There's a column to prompt them to think about the resources. So what's required to meet that objective? To think about their evidence. So what proof will they use to show that they've met their objective? And then a column for validation, which really speaks to how, who, and when they want their validation of that objective to take place. So here is just a sample again of that learning objective page. This is for the competency practice knowledge. So again, your student will fill out their objective. They'll complete the resources that are required. They'll speak to what proof will they have that this objective is met. And they'll also list, for example, how they want it to be validated. For example, they might have for their objective that they want you as the educator to validate it. And then we have the rating scale at midterm and final, which really just involves you sitting back and reviewing their objective and making a judgment about how well or how far along you feel they are in terms of meeting that objective. Are there any questions about learning objectives? Okay. So I think this moves us on to the whole process. We've covered the key components of the CBFE in terms of the 7 competencies and the learning objectives, each of which are reviewed at midterm and final. And now that we know all of this, what is the process of evaluation? So how does it all really take place? So in terms of expectations, we know If we think about your student, they're developing their personal learning objectives by the end of week 1. And we say week 1 because we feel that that's a reasonable amount of time for them to really be immersed in your environment. So they kind of have an idea about what objectives will be a good fit. That's some of the reasoning behind that. Then at midterm and final, they're going to do their own self-evaluation for the competency rating scale, as well as their learning objectives. They'll also complete their fieldwork experience evaluation form and share that with you. And that's really a separate form that allows them to provide some feedback about, their orientation and feedback and how the placement's going in those regards. Then in terms of you as the educator, in terms of your process, you want to set those minimum placement expectations for each competency, for the level of fieldwork, for advanced fieldwork. You want to collaborate and check in with your student about their learning plan, their personal learning objectives, really just giving them some feedback about whether or not it's realistic or doable. And then at midterm and final, you're going to be providing those ratings and comments on the competency rating scale for each competency and each learning objective. And really what the evaluation often should look like is essentially some form of meeting where you're actually having an opportunity to sit down and discuss the evaluation with your student. They're also able to sit down and review their own self-evaluation with you. By midterm, you'll have, hopefully, the goal is to be developing that relationship where you can sit down and have a conversation about where your student's at and how they feel they're doing. Sometimes educators do find it helpful to email or share their evaluation with their student before the actual midterm or final meeting, just so they have a bit of a chance to digest it. Your student could do the same with you. They could share their self-evaluation with you before you meet. There's a few different ways of doing it, but the important thing is that you have that chance to sit down and discuss. Ideally, nothing should be that surprising on the evaluation if you've had those opportunities to share some feedback with each other along the way. Again, I just want to reiterate that you're not expected to indicate if the placement's a pass or fail. Once it's all done, you don't need to do this at midterm, but once the placement's completed, that's when you would send all of your evaluation forms into OT Fieldwork. So that's your evaluation of the student's self-evaluation, as well as that fieldwork experience form. All 3 forms, we ask that you send those in. Typically for advanced fieldwork, because students are transitioning to practice and potentially looking at jobs being lined up pretty soon, we ask that you send it in as soon as possible, ideally at the latest by Tuesday of the following week, that fieldwork is done. I think I've covered this slide. Tricks and tips. I just want to reiterate here, I encourage you to read through all of these tricks and tips. I do want to reiterate that we have had feedback and we know that sometimes the CBFE form can be a bit fickle. So we don't want you to struggle with the form. If you are having issues, please email us right away and we will work with you to help make the form more functional. One of the best practices with the CBFE is once you receive it, you want to save it in another folder on your computer, use that save as feature every time and rename it, close it, and then open it again. So that seems to be the most sort of easiest way of ensuring that your information is getting saved properly. So downloading it, saving it under a new name, and ideally using that save as feature each time you edit. So you might have a couple different versions. Just a warning that sometimes if you have or you're working from a Mac with the preview mode, sometimes what happens is it shows incorrect numbers. As a student, you might have recalled some instances where marks seemed lower. And then once we open it up in the reader version, it shows the correct score. So check with us if you have concerns. Once again, we don't want you to struggle. So reach out sooner than later and we'll help you problem solve getting through it.